The intelligence report landed on Adolf Hitler's desk in the Wolf's Lair on the morning of November 7, 1941. Generaloberst Franz Halder, Chief of the Army General Staff, 57 years old, and already showing the strain of 4 months of war in Russia, had compiled it personally. The numbers were impossible. They had to be impossible. According to captured documents and interrogations of Soviet prisoners, according to reconnaissance photographs and reports from forward units, the Soviet Union had relocated more than 800 industrial enterprises eastward since June. Not damaged factories limping to safety. Not a few critical plants. 800 complete industrial facilities, dismantled, transported, and being reassembled beyond the Ural Mountains, beyond the reach of German bombers, beyond the reach of German tanks, beyond the reach of anything Germany could do to stop them. Hitler read the report twice. Then he set it down and stared at the map of European Russia that covered most of his conference table. The blue arrows marking German advances looked impressive. Moscow was less than 200 miles away. Leningrad was encircled. The breadbasket of Ukraine was occupied. The Donets industrial basin was in German hands. By every conventional measure of warfare, the Soviet Union should be collapsing. Instead, according to Halder's report, Soviet tank production in October had actually increased compared to September, not decreased, increased. While German forces were occupying Soviet territory that had contained nearly half of the Soviet Union's pre-war industrial capacity. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Hitler summoned Halder and several other senior officers that afternoon. Sometimes allowed himself to think aloud rather than issue pronouncements. Wilhelm Keitel, Chief of the Armed Forces High Command, was there, Alfred Hodel, Chief of Operations Staff, Fritz Tod, Minister of Armaments, and Halder, with his reports and his maps and his uncomfortable truths. How is this possible? Hitler asked, tapping the intelligence summary. We control their industrial heartland. We've occupied territory with 60% of their coal production, nearly half their pig iron, 40% of their grain. How are they producing more tanks? Halder, who had been expecting this question for weeks, had prepared his answer carefully. They moved the factories, my Führer. Not just the equipment. Entire plants. The Kharkov Locomotive Works, that produced Train-Quatre tanks, was evacuated to Nizhny Tagil in September. They transported the machinery by rail. According to our intelligence, the first tank came off the reassembled production line in early December. 3 months after, the evacuation began. Hitler's expression didn't change, but those who knew him well could see the tightening around his eyes. 3 months, he repeated. They moved an entire tank factory 1,000 miles and had it producing again in 3 months? The Kirov plant in Leningrad was evacuated to Chelyabinsk, Halder continued. The Stalin tractor plant, the Zaporozhye steel works. Our count is over 1,500 major enterprises relocated since June, with perhaps 2/3 already operational, or nearly so. They're calling the Chelyabinsk complex Tankograd. It's producing more tanks than the entire Kharkov facility was before the war. The room was silent. Fritz Tod, who understood industrial production in a way that few military men did, finally spoke. To dismantle a steel mill or a tank factory, load it onto trains, transport it thousands of kilometers, then reassemble it and have it operational, within months requires a level of organization and ruthlessness we didn't credit them with. How many trains? Hitler asked. According to Reichsbahn intelligence analyzing Soviet rail movements, they're estimating between 15,000 and 20,000 freight cars per month dedicated to industrial evacuation. That's in addition to military transport, troop movements, and civilian evacuation. The scale is... He didn't finish the sentence. What Tot didn't say, what none of them said in that room, was that Germany couldn't have done it. The German industrial base was too integrated, too dependent on specific infrastructure. too bound to established supply chains. The idea of dismantling Krupp or the Ruhr Valley steel complexes and moving them to Bavaria or Poland was logistically inconceivable. And the implications were becoming clearer with each week that passed. Hitler had invaded the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941, convinced that the campaign would last 8 to 10 weeks, 12 at most. The intelligence assessments had been clear. The Soviet Union had roughly 150 divisions in Western Russia. The Soviet regime, weakened by Stalin's purges, facing military catastrophe, would collapse. Perhaps there would be internal revolt. Perhaps Stalin himself would be overthrown. Either way, the war would be over before winter. That had been the plan. That had been the assumption. Every aspect of Operation Barbarossa had been built on that assumption. The Wehrmacht had invaded with supplies for 8 weeks of combat. Vehicle maintenance was scheduled for a victory parade in Moscow, not for a winter campaign. Winter uniforms hadn't been manufactured in sufficient quantities because the troops wouldn't need them. They'd be home before the snow fell. The assumptions had been based on intelligence about Soviet military strength, about industrial capacity, about the regime's stability. And every single assumption had been wrong. Holder had compiled the pre-invasion estimates. Sherman intelligence had calculated that the Soviet Union could field perhaps 200 divisions total. They'd encountered 360 by mid-August. German intelligence had estimated Soviet tank production at 8,000 units per year. Based on captured factories and documents, the actual number appeared to be closer to 15,000. And German intelligence had assumed that losing the Western industrial regions would cripple Soviet war production. Instead, Soviet production was not just continuing, it was accelerating. The evacuation had begun almost immediately after the invasion. June 24, 1941, just 2 days after German forces crossed the border, Stalin had issued a directive establishing the Council for Evacuation. And desperate, save Soviet industry from German occupation, move it east, keep it producing. The operation that followed was unprecedented in scale. Entire factories were dismantled while German aircraft bombed them. Machinery weighing dozens of tons was cut apart with torches, loaded onto flat cars, transported east while Soviet soldiers fought delaying actions to buy time. Workers and their families went with the equipment. Engineers, skilled mechanists, factory directors, whole communities uprooted and sent to cities in the Urals and Siberia that could barely house them. The Kharkov Locomotive Plant, Factory number 183, the primary producer of 34 medium tanks, had begun evacuation on September 19. German forces were approaching the city. Artillery fire was already hitting the factory district. Engineers worked in shifts, cutting apart assembly lines, crating machinery, loading everything onto trains that departed as soon as they were filled. The trains travelled east, through the autumn, across 1,000 miles of steppe, through the Urals to Nizhny Tagil. There, in a city that had been primarily known for metallurgy, the plant was being reassembled. Not in proper factory buildings, those didn't exist yet. Workers assembled tanks in temperatures that dropped below zero. The first 34 rolled off the reassembled line on December 27, 1941, 99 days after the evacuation had begun. Similar stories were playing out across the Soviet East. The Kirov plant from Leningrad, the largest tank production facility in the Soviet Union before the war, was evacuated to Chelyabinsk in October. The Chelyabinsk tractor plant was already there. The two facilities merged, combining evacuated equipment with existing industrial capacity. By December, the complex was producing heavy KV tanks and T-34 Segunda simultaneously. Production rates that winter exceeded what either facility had achieved individually before the war. The aviation industry followed the same pattern. Aircraft factories from Moscow, from Leningrad, from Ukraine, were transported east. Approximately 100 aviation facilities were evacuated between June and December. They were reassembled in the Urals, in Siberia, in Central Asia. By early 1942, Soviet aircraft production from the relocated factories was approaching pre-war levels. Steel production, ammunition plants, chemical facilities, engine factories, all were moving east. The scale of the operation was staggering. More than 1,500 large enterprises. Over 10 million workers and their families. The trains carrying the dismantled factories shared tracks with trains carrying troops to the front, with trains evacuating civilians, with trains transporting grain and fuel, and everything else required to keep a nation at war functioning. The chaos was considerable. Trains arrived to destinations without the workers who knew how to operate the equipment. Equipment arrived without critical components that had been loaded on different trains. Some factories simply disappeared in transit, their cargo stolen or lost or misdirected to wrong destinations. The Soviet railway system, operating beyond its design capacity, suffered thousands of breakdowns. Locomotives broke down, tracks buckled under overweight loads. Switching yards became clogged with trains waiting for assignment to new destinations. But enough arrived. Enough equipment reached the Urals, reached Siberia, reached the new industrial centers being created in the Soviet interior, and enough skilled workers survived the journey to operate that equipment, and enough engineers and managers maintained enough organizational control to reassemble the plants and restart production. By December 1941, when Hitler was reading Halder's intelligence summary, the evacuation was largely complete. The majority of Soviet industry that could be moved had been moved. The factories were being reassembled. Some were already producing. Within months, most would be operational. And Hitler, staring at his maps in the Wolf's Lair, was beginning to understand what that meant. The German offensive toward Moscow had stalled in November. Exhaustion, supply problems, the first serious cold weather, all contributed. But the primary factor was Soviet resistance. The Red Army was not collapsing. New divisions kept appearing. Soviet attacks, though costly, continued. And Soviet equipment, particularly the Tarente Quatre tanks, was proving superior to German armor in combat. Where were these new divisions coming from? Where were the tanks coming from? If Germany had destroyed so much Soviet industry, occupied so much territory, killed so many Soviet soldiers, why was resistance strengthening rather than weakening? The answer was in Halder's report. The answer was in the factories being reassembled beyond the Urals. The answer was in Stalin's decision, made in the first days of the war, to sacrifice space and time and immediate production capacity in order to preserve the industrial base that would win a long war. Hitler had planned for a short war. A blitzkrieg. 8 weeks. 12 at most. The entire operational concept of Barbarossa was built on speed, on destroying Soviet forces before they could retreat, on capturing industrial centers before they could be evacuated, on achieving victory before the Soviet Union could mobilize its vast resources. But the Soviets hadn't fought the war Hitler had planned. They'd retreated. They'd evacuated their industry, while Hitler's forces were occupying empty territory. And now, 5 months into the campaign, with German forces exhausted and winter approaching, Soviet industrial production was not only continuing but increasing. In that November meeting at the Wolf's Lair, Hitler had begun to ask questions that revealed how fundamentally his assumptions had been wrong. Questions about Soviet industrial capacity, about rail networks, about how many workers could be relocated, about how quickly factories could be reassembled, about where the Soviets were finding the resources to continue fighting. The answers were uncomfortable. Soviet industrial planning in the 1930s, whatever its human costs, had created redundant capacity. Multiple cities could produce tanks, aircraft, ammunition. The loss of one facility could be compensated by expanding others. The railway system, primitive by Western standards, was extensive enough and robust enough to support the massive evacuation. The Soviet population, whatever its suffering under Stalin's regime, was providing the labor to rebuild industry in the East. And Hitler's belief that the Soviet regime would collapse under military pressure was proving completely wrong. Stalin's control was absolute. Was managing the evacuation, the relocation, the reconstruction. There were no signs of internal revolt, no indications that military defeat would lead to political disintegration. The campaign was not going to be won in 8 weeks. It was not going to be won in 12 weeks. It might not be won at all. That realization, in November 1941, was not something Hitler could acknowledge openly. Not to his generals. Not to the German people. Not even fully to himself. The entire structure of Nazi ideology, the propaganda about German superiority and Slavic inferiority, the promises of rapid victory, all depended on the war ending quickly and triumphantly. So Hitler ordered the offensive toward Moscow to continue, ordered his exhausted, undersupplied, freezing troops to make one more effort, ordered them to believe that one more push would break Soviet resistance, would capture Moscow, would end the war. It didn't work. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the push, subscribe button, and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The Soviet counteroffensive began on December 5, 1941. General Georgy Zhukov, 45 years old, commanding Western Front forces defending Moscow, had been waiting for this moment. He'd assembled reserves in secret, fresh divisions from Siberia and the Far East, troops equipped for winter warfare, Trente-Quatre tanks that could operate in temperatures where German panzers froze solid. At 4 in the morning, Soviet artillery opened fire across a 600-mile front. Then came the infantry, white-clad figures emerging from the snow, supported by tanks that German anti-tank guns couldn't stop. The Wehrmacht, exhausted after 5 months of continuous combat, frozen in positions without winter clothing, short on ammunition and fuel, began to retreat. By January 7, 1942, German forces had been pushed back between 60 and 150 miles from Moscow. Some sectors retreated further. The retreat cost the Wehrmacht over 100,000 casualties in the first month alone. Entire divisions collapsed. It was Germany's first major defeat on land in the war, and it was made possible by those factories beyond the Urals. The Trente-Quatre tanks that spearheaded Zhukov's counteroffensive came from Nizhny Tagil, from Chelyabinsk, from the evacuated and reassembled plants that Hitler's intelligence had reported in November. The ammunition came from relocated munitions factories. The aircraft providing air support came from aviation plants that had been in Moscow and Leningrad 3 months earlier. Hitler, receiving reports of the retreat, dismissed Field Marshal Walther von Brauchitsch as commander-in-chief of the army and assumed direct command himself. He issued orders that there would be no retreat. Units would hold their positions regardless of circumstances. It was the same rigidity, the same refusal to acknowledge reality that had prevented the evacuation of Soviet industry from being taken seriously as a strategic threat. And Hitler was beginning to understand, though he would never admit it publicly, that the assumptions underlying Barbarossa had been catastrophically wrong. 6 months later, on June 4, 1942, Hitler made a surprise visit to Finland. The official reason was to congratulate Field Marshal Carl Gustaf Emil Mannerheim on his 75th birthday. The actual reason was to ensure that Finland remained Germany's ally, to prevent any Finnish negotiations with the Soviets or the Western powers. The meeting took place in Mannerheim's private railway car at Imola Airfield. Present were Finnish President Risto Ryti, Herman Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, and various staff officers. Finnish sound engineer Thor Damon was there to record official speeches for public broadcast. What happened next was an accident that would provide historians with the only known recording of Hitler speaking in a normal, conversational tone. Damon recorded the official greetings and speeches. Then, as Hitler and Mannerheim settled into the private car for lunch and cigars, Damon's recording equipment kept running. For 11 minutes, before Hitler's security discovered what was happening and ordered the recording stopped, the machine captured Hitler's voice. And in those 11 minutes, Hitler revealed what he would never say in public. He spoke about Soviet industrial capacity, with something approaching shock. If someone had told me that a country could start with 35,000 tanks, Hitler said, his voice tired and strained, then I would have said, "You are crazy." Mannerheim, who had fought the Soviets in the Winter War and knew their industrial strength better than the Germans had, responded quietly. During the Winter War, we had not even thought of this. Hitler continued, the words tumbling out in a way they never did in his public speeches. If one of my generals had declared that a state here had 35,000 tanks, I would have said, Mein Herr, you are seeing everything double or tenfold. This is crazy. You are seeing ghosts. I had not thought this possible. He described discovering Soviet tank factories during the German advance, facilities that German intelligence hadn't known existed. We have found industrial plants, Hitler said. One of them, for example, that was under construction 2 years ago, and we had no idea. And today there is a tank production facility that, in the first shift alone, employed a bit over 30,000 workers, and in full development should have employed more than 60,000 workers. One single tank production facility. We have occupied it. A gargantuan facility. The scale of Soviet industrial capacity, the depth of resources Germany had failed to understand, came through in every sentence. This was not Hitler the orator, not Hitler the confident Führer promising inevitable victory. This was Hitler the strategist, confronted with evidence that everything he'd believed about the Soviet Union was wrong. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The recording ended when Hitler's security staff discovered the still-running equipment and ordered it shut down. The Finnish engineer, remarkably, was allowed to keep the recording. It remained secret until 1957. But the moment captured in those 11 minutes revealed a truth that Hitler's public pronouncements concealed. Germany had invaded the Soviet Union, expecting to face a primitive, disorganized state that would collapse under military pressure. Instead, they'd encountered an industrial power capable of relocating its entire manufacturing base 1,000 miles and resuming production within 2 months. The war would continue for another 3 years. Germany would launch new offensives. Stalingrad would become a name synonymous with military catastrophe. Kursk would see the largest tank battle in history. The tide would turn inexorably against Germany. But the fundamental strategic reality was established in 1941. The Soviet Union could replace its losses. Germany could not. Soviet production, relocated beyond German reach, would steadily increase while German industry came under Allied bombing. By 1942, Soviet tank production exceeded 15,000 units annually. By 1943, it reached 24,000. By 1944, it approached 30,000. The factories Hitler's forces had captured in Ukraine and Belarusia were producing for Germany now, but at reduced capacity, hampered by sabotage and partisan activity, never reaching their pre-war output. The factories beyond the Urals were producing at levels that exceeded pre-war capacity. It was the industrial equivalent of a race that Germany had lost before they realized they were running. The evacuation had cost the Soviet Union dearly. The chaos of relocation, the production losses during the month's factories were being moved and reassembled. The workers who died during the evacuation, from cold, from starvation, from German bombs. The families torn apart. The communities destroyed. Estimates suggest that 12 million people were evacuated along with the factories. Many never returned home. The cities in the Urals and Siberia that received the evacuated plants were overwhelmed. Housing didn't exist. Food supplies were inadequate. Workers lived in barracks, in tents, in conditions that would have been considered uninhabitable in peacetime. But the factories produced, under tarps in open fields, in wooden sheds, in conditions where oil froze and metal became brittle. Soviet workers assembled tanks and aircraft and ammunition, not because they loved Stalin's regime, not because communist ideology inspired them, but because the Germans were destroying their country, and production was survival. The German generals, watching this unfold, understood what Hitler could not admit. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, perhaps Germany's most capable operational commander, wrote after the war about the moment he realized the Soviet Union could not be defeated militarily. It was not at Stalingrad. It was not at Kursk. It was in late 1941 and early 1942 when German intelligence reports began documenting Soviet production capacity in the relocated factories. "We could win battles," Manstein wrote, "but we could not win the war. The Soviets could replace every tank we destroyed, every aircraft we shot down, every soldier we killed." That arithmetic was established by the end of 1941. Everything after that was merely playing out the inevitable conclusion. General Heinz Guderian, Germany's foremost armoured warfare tactician, visited the Eastern Front in November 1941 and returned horrified, not by Soviet military capability, though the 34 tanks had shocked German armour commanders, but by the evidence of Soviet industrial strength. "We thought we were fighting a backward nation," Guderian said to colleagues. "We were fighting an industrial power that had more resources and more determination than we had imagined possible." The tragedy was that this should not have surprised them. Soviet industrial development in the 1930s had been documented by Western observers. John Scott, an American who worked at Magnitogorsk in the Urals during the 30s, published a book in 1942 describing the massive industrial complexes being built beyond German reach. British and American military attaches in Moscow had reported on Soviet industrial capacity, but German intelligence had filtered this information through ideological assumptions. The Soviets were Slavs, therefore inferior. The Soviet system was communist, therefore inefficient. Soviet industry was backward, therefore incapable of supporting a modern war. These assumptions, comforting and confirming German superiority, had shaped every aspect of Operation Barbarossa. The 8-week timeline, the lack of winter preparation, the focus on territorial conquest over destroying Soviet industrial capacity, all were based on the belief that the Soviet Union would break quickly under military pressure. The evacuation of Soviet industry proved those assumptions wrong, but the proof came too late. By the time Hitler was speaking to Mannerheim in June 1942, German forces were already preparing for the summer offensive that would end at Stalingrad. The operational flexibility, the possibility of negotiated peace, the option of strategic withdrawal, all were foreclosed by decisions made in 1941 based on faulty assumptions about Soviet industrial strength. The German military had built a machine designed to win short wars through operational excellence, blitzkrieg tactics, encirclement battles, rapid advances that collapsed enemy morale and organization. It was a system that had worked in Poland, in France, in the Balkans, but the Soviet Union was not Poland or France. The Soviet Union had space to trade for time. It had resources to replace losses. It had an industrial base that could be moved beyond German reach. And it had a leadership, however brutal, that was willing to pay any price to continue fighting. It condemned millions to hardship and death. The workers who froze assembling tanks in Siberian winters. The families separated and scattered across the Soviet interior. The cities stripped of their industrial capacity and left vulnerable to German occupation. But it was strategically correct. It preserved the capacity to wage war. Germany, the knockout blow that Barbarossa was designed to deliver. It transformed the conflict from a short war of maneuver into a long war of attrition. And in a war of attrition, industrial capacity determined outcomes. By 1945, when Berlin fell and the Third Reich surrendered, Soviet industry had produced over 100,000 tanks and self-propelled guns, over 130,000 aircraft, hundreds of thousands of artillery pieces, millions of tons of ammunition. The evacuation had succeeded. The cost was enormous, but the strategic goal was achieved. Soviet industry survived, relocated, and ultimately prevailed. What Hitler said to Mannerheim in June 1942, in that accidentally recorded conversation, was admission of a strategic miscalculation so fundamental it determined the war's outcome. The surprise in his voice, the shock at Soviet industrial capacity, the realization that Germany had invaded a country whose resources it had completely misunderstood. It was not the admission of a man who expected to win. It was the recognition of someone discovering, too late, that the war he had started was not the war he thought he was fighting. The German generals, in their post-war memoirs, would struggle to explain Barbarossa's failure. They blamed Hitler's interference. They blamed the weather. They blamed inadequate resources and overextended supply lines. All true. But underlying all those factors was a more fundamental error. They had underestimated their enemy. Not underestimated Soviet soldiers, who fought with courage and determination. Not underestimated Soviet generals, who learned and adapted despite catastrophic early losses, but underestimated Soviet industrial capacity, underestimated the organizational capability that could relocate 1,500 factories in 6 months. Underestimated the determination that would keep those factories producing under conditions that should have made production impossible. That underestimation, born of ideology and sustained by intelligence failures, cost Germany the war in the East. And the war in the East, consuming 3/4 of Germany's military strength, determined the outcome of World War II. In the end, what Hitler said to Mannerheim was less important than what he couldn't say. He couldn't acknowledge that the assumptions underlying Barbarossa had been wrong from the start. He couldn't accept that the war was already lost, though the fighting would continue for 3 more years. So he spoke about 35,000 tanks with bewilderment. He described gargantuan factories with surprise. He expressed shock at Soviet industrial capacity, as if it were a natural disaster, unpredictable and unavoidable, rather than the foreseeable, the result of Soviet industrial development that German intelligence had failed to assess accurately. The evacuation of Soviet industry in 1941 was not the largest military operation of the war. It was not the bloodiest battle. It was not the most dramatic moment. It denied Germany the quick victory that Barbarossa required. It created the industrial foundation for Soviet victory. And when Hitler spoke to Mannerheim about his surprise at Soviet industrial strength, he was acknowledging, without quite admitting it, that the war was already lost. Not lost on the battlefield, though battlefields would matter. Lost in the industrial heartland beyond the Urals, where factories reassembled under tarpaulins in Siberian winter produced the weapons that would ultimately destroy the Third Reich. The numbers were stark. Germany's total wartime tank production was approximately 67,000 units. Soviet production exceeded 100,000. German aircraft production peaked at 40,000 units in 1944. Soviet production exceeded 130,000 across the war. In artillery, ammunition, vehicles, all categories of war production, Soviet output eventually exceeded German capacity. That industrial superiority was established by the decision, made in June 1941, to evacuate Soviet factories rather than defend them in place, to sacrifice immediate production for future capacity, to endure the chaos and cost of relocation in order to preserve the industrial base. It was a gamble. If German forces had reached the Urals, if the factories had been captured or destroyed during transit, if production could not be resumed in the eastern regions, the gamble would have failed. The Soviet Union would have lost its industrial capacity and with it, any hope of continued resistance. But the gamble succeeded. The factories reached their destinations. Production resumed. And by 1942, Soviet industry beyond German reach was producing at levels that made German victory impossible. What Hitler said when Stalin moved those factories was revealing precisely because it was unscripted. The shock, the surprise, the admission that German intelligence had fundamentally misunderstood Soviet industrial capacity. In 11 minutes of accidentally recorded conversation, Hitler revealed the strategic blindness that doomed Barbarossa. He thought he was invading a backward nation with primitive industry. He found an industrial power capable of extraordinary organizational achievement. He expected rapid collapse. He got protracted resistance. He planned for an 8-week campaign. He got a 4-year catastrophe. And the difference between Hitler's expectations and reality was established in those first 6 months of 1941, when Soviet factories disappeared from German reach and reappeared beyond the Urals, producing the weapons that would drive German forces back to Berlin. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.